So I'm going to be talking about vertical rhythm and how we don't have it and how we're going to try to get it. The first thing we want to understand, I guess, is, well, why does a typographer want when they're trying to lay out the page and their goal is to look pretty? And they use a lot of measuring and adjustment to get there. So we have like the top line of things visually aligns with the top line of other things visually. And then you want to have enough line spacing between all the lines so that you can fit whatever needs to go in between the lines. And you want those spaces to be even between all of the lines so that you get this nice rhythm from the baseline to baseline spacing. And if stuff overlaps, it's your fault. You're the typographer. You're not supposed to do that. Please fix it before you send it to the printer. But on the web, we don't really have that option, so we have CSS. The CSS Line Box Model was developed in the 90s. The goal of the Line Box Model is to not overlap the content. It does this with boxes. We're all about boxes in CSS. So it's really very simple. We have a bunch of stuff. We put it on a line. We draw a box around it. We stack up all the line boxes that we create in this manner. And then we're done. We have a paragraph. But it doesn't look very even, does it? No. So, well, the typographers are not very happy with CSS. So what they want is they want vertical rhythm. Why do they want it? Well, things look prettier when you line them up. And you kind of want things to go across the columns, or if you're printing books, you want them to be back to back on the same page. And just, humans like it when things line up. So it would be nice if we could do that. To get things to line up, we need to get things to have even spacing within the paragraph, also between the paragraphs. And also we have to handle interruptions like headings and tables and figures and captions. And so these are the problems we have to solve. We can break it down into these three pieces. The first one we'll start out, which is in some ways the simplest and in some ways the most difficult, is the intra-paragraph spacing. So like spacing between lines within a paragraph. Our goal is to fix the line layout model to make the typographers happy, but also not to overlap the content. But to understand how to fix it, we have to understand where we're at today. And so we're going to go over the CSS line layout model. So we put stuff on a line, right? And then we draw a box around it. Well, what are we putting on the line? How big is it? If we don't know how big it is and where it is, we can't draw a box around it. So first, we have to find out what it is and how big it is. And for text, that means looking at the font metrics. With like atomic inlines like images and inline blocks and things, like we just use the CSS box model. There's already boxes. We know where the rectangles are. It's very straightforward. With text, it's a lot more complicated, and we're going to find out just how bad it is. It would be super simple if I had installed the correct fonts on Windows. It would be great if we had fonts that had where you said, I want, I'm sorry, this is broken. Last minute technical changes when we swapped operating systems 5 minutes ago. So it would be nice if 1em meant, you got like measurements of 1em and your font size matched your actual font size that you requested, but that's not how it actually works when you ask for a font of, say, 10 pixels. Different fonts have different opinions of what that should mean. And so you can see a variety of options here. So the Swatsdi font here is pretty close to 1em, as you saw on this page. And part of it goes above the baseline and part of it goes below the baseline. And it says my ascent, which is how high I go above the baseline, is this much, and my descent is this much. And if it adds up to 1em, then actually you get to do math on your document and figure out how things go and make some sense out of it. But most fonts don't work that way. They leave a little extra space above the top of the glyphs so that if you have accents and other things stacking on top of them or below them, If you have various writing systems that take up a little bit more space than the Latin alphabet, there's plenty of space left to that. So as you notice, we've got two variants of Arial. One of them has a lot more space. It's Arial Unicode MS, which is designed to handle a lot more writing systems. And so some of them are a little taller, have taller letters, so it needs to be a little taller. And so these are the sizes that the font returns when we say, hey, I want font size of like whatever this is. It gives you a variety of different sizes. So, well, okay, so that's what we get. And we wanted to, for comparison, here's what 1M looks like if it's placed about 20% below the baseline, you can see. So we have a line height property, and the purpose of this is so that we can normalize how what the height of the line is, and also to control it, so that we can say, well, I want more space between the lines, or I want less space. I'm sure you're all familiar with this property and have used it daily for a long time. So let's take a sample value, such as 1.5, which means 1.5 times the font size, whatever that happens to be. You can think of the line height as working in two different ways. The easy way to look at it, think about it, is to say, okay, it's the font size plus it's the leading, and then the leading gets us to our line height. So to find out how much the leading is, it's 1.5 ems minus 1 em, so you get 0.25 ems above and below. But the browser needs to actually know where the baseline is, and working off of the font size doesn't tell us where the baseline is. So we have to use the ascent and descent metrics. And so what we actually do is we start from 1.5 em, and then we subtract out the ascent and descent, and then the leading is what's left there, and then we split it and put half above and half below. So why do we put it half above and half below? Most other typesetting systems just put it between the lines. Well, we have in CSS, we have this kind of like not very clear distinction between boxes that have decorations and hold like significant sections of your content and just like paragraphs that are just line boxes one after the other, after the other, after the other. They're all block boxes. And if you recall, we don't know actually how big that leading is. The browser does when it calculates the font metrics, but we don't know. So if we were going to have consistent spacing between all of our lines within the paragraph, that would be great, but then within the paragraphs, but between the paragraphs, we wouldn't know how much space to put to keep that even. So putting it half on each side means that we could, in theory, have even line spacing. And which we do sometimes get if we have a paragraph of text with no font changes, which we'll take a look at that case right here. Let's say we have a line height of 1.2. We've got like the kind of aqua part represents the font, and then we've got the half leading above and below, and then you can see it's a little thicker in between the lines than at the top of the first line and the bottom of the bottom line. And that, without any font changes, gives us this beautiful rhythmic sizing of everything lines out. So great. But then that's not how things are on the web. They're not quite that simple, and we have the problem number one of varying font families. Well, as we noticed before, the font families have different font sizes, and that's fine. We're going to just apply line height to each of them, and they'll each have the same height box, right? And then that should give us, like, normalize everything. But, well, their baselines are at different positions within that font box. And so when we line them up all on the line, we want to line them on the baseline, but then the tops and bottoms don't line up anymore. So we draw our line box around all the boxes, and it is more than 1.5 ems tall. And we're sad, because that doesn't get us even spacing. There is one small win. If you happen to change your font because the font didn't have the character for the thing you were looking for, like maybe this font didn't have Chinese characters in it, the browser smartly ignores the fallback fonts, and it just uses the metrics of the first available font, which is the first font that it has on the system that would match the space character. All right, that is in fact actually how line height normal works. Line height normal is special because it takes into account all those fallback fonts and makes sure the line box is big enough for everything inside it. This is why it's really unpredictable. But it's also a really good way to make sure nothing ever overlaps. So if your goal is definitely don't overlap, this is a good way to do it. If you want rhythmic sizing, it's probably not going to help you very much. So here we have the comparison to what we want as a typographer and what we get in CSS. Basically, if you don't change the font size ever, and you don't change the font family ever, and you don't use vertical alignment ever, you can get rhythmic sizing within your paragraph. If you change any of those things, then it will be a little bit wiggly. Okay, so we want to fix that because that's not great. So we're trying to fix that. Like last year, I went to the typo conference and gave a talk, and the people were like, we really love grid layout and we really love Flexbox, but can you fix the line layout model? And I was like, well, actually, I was planning to work on that this year. I don't know how long it's going to take, so I can't guarantee anything, but we're trying. Okay, so what are we going to do? So how to have perfect rhythm. We start with the root inline box, which is an inline box that wraps all the content of the block box, all the inline content. Like every other inline, it has the half leading above and half leading below. And then we ignore all of its contents. And then we have perfect rhythm because nothing is causing anything to go taller or shorter than the line box we would have drawn around the root inline box. And it looks like that. We've seen that. But what about overlap? Like, what if somebody increases that font size? That doesn't look great, does it? We kind of would like the text to remain readable and not to overlap and stuff, so it'd be nice if we also considered whether something fits within the line box. But the definition of fits within the line box that we've been using for the last couple decades is not really great, so we have to come up with a new one. And that's where we're starting to run into some difficulties. So, all right, what does it mean if it fits? We have two things we have to consider. One is the container, and the other one's the item. If the item goes in the container without overflowing, then it fits. That would be great. But first we have to define what the container and the item are. So defining the container, we have a variety of options for defining the container. Obviously we think A fits into the line box. But we can also say that, well, B seems to fit too. The inside, if that yellow is the root font size and then the orange is the half leading above and below, then definitely B is fitting inside that area that we allotted for this line of content. And even if it overflows the content area, it's not going to overlap other content. It's definitely very safe. But oftentimes, content actually stretches a little bit into the other half of the gap on the other side. And that's okay if you have only a few things, but not if you have a lot of things. So I'm not sure if that's a thing we want to do, but it's something we should consider. And of course, there's the absolute, model of well, I don't care, just overlap whatever it is. It's my job as a typographer to make sure it fits, and hopefully you did your job and considered all the font fallbacks and the content that your user wrote and everything else. So, all right, we know that the leading box model that we've been using doesn't work for defining what the item is because it adds all this extra space that, honestly, we don't need the space to leak out. If the space leaks out of the line box, we don't really care. But if the actual content leaks out of the box, we have a problem, right? So what are we going to consider the item to be? Well, we have this concept of a margin box in CSS. Everybody understands how it works. They know how to control it. You can make things bigger and smaller with positive and negative margins. Maybe we could use that. So that's one of the ideas we're exploring. We've got, all our box model stuff. And then for an inline, it kind of looks like this. The content area is equal to the font height that we defined before, which was kind of inconsistent and included some extra space. Okay. Well, the general case is we don't have borders and margins and padding, and it kind of looks like that. Okay. But again, what about all that extra space? If it overlaps, we don't care, but if there happens to be accents there, it's a problem. Would that work? Is it okay for IL Unicode MS to leak outside a little bit? We're not really sure. So the proposal going forward is we'll have a switch, just like box sizing. Take me out of the old world, put me in the new one. Legacy value would be do what CSS 2.1 says, and the new value is normal, but what's the new normal? We're still figuring that out. if you have input into that equation, what metrics should we be using? What formulas, what calculations are we going to use to figure out what that item is that we have to fit for text? Come talk to us, and maybe next year we'll have a good answer. So that's it for intra-paragraph spacing. Now we have to talk about inter-paragraph spacing. We use margins for that. It's super easy. We just put like what's that? Default style sheet is margin 1em. It gives us some nice spacing, but actually, like my line height is 1.5em. So if I want to keep my vertical rhythm, then I need to have 1.5em's worth of margin, and then I have to like make sure that I copy over that number every time I change it. So we introduced a new unit, the line height unit. There's also a root line height unit, so that makes at least this a little bit easier. That's pretty straightforward. Then we have the problem of interrupting the rhythm with other items, and this gets a little more complicated. So let's say we have a strict rhythm here, and we want all the paragraphs to line up on the baseline. Well, there's these other things here that are like not quite the same thing, and we want to make sure that from this edge to the other edge, it lands back on that grid, right? So we have to make sure from the top margin edge here to the bottom margin edge here is some multiple of the line height. We also have to do that when it wraps to another line. That gets a little tricky. We don't really know how many lines it is. What if we have an image? What if we have a block quote? Oh yeah, we tried. We kind of failed at the end here. It wasn't great. So strict rhythms are important for things like MultiCall, where you want things to align side by side. But if you only have one column of content, actually, it's kind of okay to break the rhythm once in a while. So like in this case, we kind of cared more about the spacing to be exactly the spacing that's ideal, because this item's pretty large, and like you're probably not going to notice that the rhythm got interrupted, but you might care for like the shorter things, like headings. So these are both different ways of doing rhythm. We want to try and accommodate both of them. So one of the ideas we're exploring right now is block step sizing. What that does is it says, I want the height of the block to be a multiple of this length, where it can be any multiple of the length, but it has to be a multiple of this length. And then we insert a little bit of extra space to make sure that it's that length. But if we are interested in extra space, where are we going to insert it? Well, we could insert it into the margin. We could insert it into the padding. Inserting into the border probably doesn't make sense, so we're probably not going to do that. So we're thinking we could add a switch, maybe. Then you have to decide whether you want to add the space at the top or the bottom or both. If you have an element that's already got some alignment properties set on it, you might want to copy that same alignment. And so that's what the auto value does. And then you could center it or you can start align it. We've had feedback from people in Japan that, for example, that certain kinds of content they prefer having it start aligned and certain kinds prefer to be centered. So that's drafted up in the CSS rhythmic sizing draft, which is currently looking for feedback. Doesn't have a lot of open issues. The other interesting question there is what happens if the page and column breaks. Probably you want to apply the step sizing to each fragment, but that's another interesting question. Depends what you're trying to use that feature for. If it's for rhythmic sizing, probably per fragment. If you're trying to do something else, I'm not sure. So that's inter-paragraph spacing. And then we have, remember how we wanted to get things to line up? We want to get things to line up. So this is the current problem we have, is like, hey, align me to the top of this image. And you're like, okay, well, there's a lot of margin there. That's easy. Let's get rid of the margin. But that's not quite right yet either, because there's all that space above the capital A. We want to get rid of that too, but that's within the font. So that's much harder to figure out. What is that? We could use negative margins maybe, but then if we change the font, it doesn't really line up anymore, and that's bad. We don't like that. So what we could do is look at, okay, well, these fonts have information inside them, and one of the useful ones is like cap height is a font metric that we could look at. And then if we know the cap height and we know the ascent, we can figure out what that gap is. So one proposal that we are looking at is to add a property to say, I want to trim the top of that line box down to this metric. Like the top of the ascent, or get rid of the let and get rid of that half letting. Or maybe I want to get rid of all of it down to the top of the capital letter, or maybe even all the way down to the top of the lowercase letters. And of course, we need to have values for other writing systems. So we've got an ideographic value for CJK writing systems, Chinese and Korean and Japanese. But there's other writing systems out there, and we'll need to add values for those. Okay, so anyway, so we're working in English. So we say, okay, letting trim cap. And it brings it down to the cap height. And look, I didn't have to do any math. I don't have to put magic numbers in my style sheet. If I change the font, it's going to just work. And everybody's happy, including the person who did not manage to download the font on your web font system. Other things we can use this for is getting centering to actually look centered. If you trim the top of the capital letters and the bottom to the alphabetic and then center it, then it actually really looks centered, right? And then if you do it in CSS, rather than doing it with magic numbers and have the browser do the calculations based on font metrics, then it works even if your fonts kind of get changed, swapped out, don't load, whatever. But we have the problem, which is that we only actually really considered Latin and ideographic fonts. And there are metrics for these in OpenType, but there are no metrics for the equivalent metrics of like Hebrew fonts, for example. What about Thai? Like these things are not in OpenType. So getting it to work for the whole world is going to be a process of getting it. It's not just like add a keyword to CSS and get the browsers to implement it. We have to go talk to the OpenType people and be like, hey, we need more metrics. And you have to add them in the font, and we need a table that has like had more values in it. And then you have to go talk to the people making the font and be like, yo, give us these numbers so that we can do this right. And then the people out there making websites will kind of be like, oh, I tried to use this font and it doesn't work. And I'm like, well, we'll have to be like, oh, yeah, well, there's a lot of fonts out there that just put fake numbers in there. So, yeah, your metrics are bad. You should feel bad. The drop cap doesn't look pretty. Like, go fix your font. Anyways, so there's a bunch of fiddly details we have to work out. There's a bunch of like talking to people we have to work out, but there's also some open questions we have to work out, like what happens at a page break. Usually if you're trimming the top of that first column, you might want to trim the top of the second column, but we don't know which, that's not the first line in the box, right? That's just some random line that like happened to land after a page break. So maybe we need another property that says like letting trim at breaks. And then another question is, okay, well, do I want to tell you every time I want to trim down to the visible text which metric I want? Like, doesn't it get a little tedious to be like, oh yeah, I'm in Hebrew, like please give me the Hebrew version for this document. And then you can't reuse your style sheet as well. So maybe we should pull out the which metric question from the please trim this down question and have them cascade as separate properties. So that's another consideration. And then another one is like, well, what do you do if you have multiple font sizes on that first line? Do you trim it down to the top one, the tallest one, the shortest one, the root one? Like, what are we planning to do here? Take the average? Probably not the average. I don't think we want the average. So these are kind of open questions. This is still in a design phase of this feature. If you've got feedback on it, if you've got ideas, come talk to the working group, file issues in the GitHub repo. We want to figure this out sooner so that we can make all of the typographers happy and have their nice like alignment. So other things. Well, speaking of alignment, another thing these metrics are useful for is vertical alignment. You might not think about it like ever, but actually like the browser is constantly doing like some pretty interesting vertical alignment whenever it typesets the text, because with all the other boxes, we're just like, okay, we're going to line up everything at 0, and then that's lining things up, right? And we just start at the top and then work our way down, and we don't make a gap. But with text, that doesn't look good. So you have to match. So you match the baselines, and the vertical align property works like this. First thing it does is it takes the two inlines that it's looking at, and it's like, okay, well, where's the baselines? Let's match the baselines. and then it shifts. So like the super value matches the baselines and then shifts it up by like the super like thing that the font says is like, this is how much superscripts go up. Or the length value is like, first you match the baseline, then you move the item up. But then the question is which baseline? Oh, there was a lot of baselines, you didn't know? So we're familiar with the alphabetic baseline, which as you see hits right below that A. But there's also an ideographic baseline. There's the middle baseline, which is really some weird thing that goes right through the middle of an X. And that's what vertical line middle uses. And we also have a hanging baseline that is sometimes useful for index scripts. There's a central baseline that's actually used in vertical typesetting for CJK languages, and there's also a mathematical baseline, which runs straight through the minus sign, right through the middle of that equal sign, through the middle of the brackets, trying to keep everything like balanced and equal on either side. And so sometimes you might want to use a different baseline, like when typesetting equations. So there's a dominant baseline property. It says, okay, well, which baseline are you interested in using for me when I'm matching up these fonts of different sizes and families? Which of the baselines should I use? And there's a lot more values. I can't really fit them all on one line. And then the vertical align property, like this property inherits. You just set it once at the top of your document, forget about it. The vertical align property also says, well, okay, well, if you want it, by default, like the baseline that we're going to use is going to be whatever the dominant baseline is. But maybe you have a particular piece of text or a particular image or something that you want to align slightly differently, and you can actually choose a dynamic baseline specifically for that, and then shift it. So, right. Or not shift it. Maybe you just want it to be like, please match it, don't shift it. So their vertical line properties getting a couple of new longhands. The names were determined by a bunch of SVG folks like a long time ago, so we're kind of stuck with them. And that's also going into the next version of CSS inline layout. And one other thing we use metrics for is drop caps. So there is maybe not so much to say for the authoring side on how drop caps. They're awesome. You can just say initial letters 2, and it does all the math for you, assuming your font, put not fake numbers in the font. The amount of math is kind of crazy, and it's actually a whole little mini layout system that's like pretty complicated. And so we're about halfway through figuring out the details of how does it interact with floats, how does it interact with like all that stuff. You don't want to know about it. You just want it to work. Our job is to make it just work. We're working on it. How can you help? You can think about these things and then comment on issues or file new issues. Tell us what you're thinking and what you think is needed and what you think we messed up and what you think we didn't consider. The CSS Working Group operates in the open. We're on GitHub. We take feedback from literally anybody. No, really, we really do. And then you can bug browser vendors and be like, hey, they wrote this spec. I think it's awesome. Please implement it. You can bug the font vendors to provide correct metrics. If you buy your fonts from like a better font vendor, then they will hopefully have better metrics. But the cheap free ones maybe don't have such good metrics because they don't. Sometimes they do, the like open source ones. But but you can bug the people that are supporting their fonts. Fonts are pieces of software too. They have bugs, and you can be like, hey, you have a bug. Your cap height is off, and my drop cap isn't working correctly. You can also, if you know anyone working on the OpenType spec, ask them to define the missing metrics and get worldwide support for drop caps. And that's the end of this presentation. And I would be happy to answer any questions you have.
All right. So we've got a few questions about vertical rhythm and whatnot.
Okay.
First off,
yes.
Apparently for some people, went a little bit too fast with the definition of vertical rhythm. Can you give me a little bit more explanation of what that means?
So one of the things that there's a number of aspects of graphic designs that you're taking into account when you're trying to create it. There's different techniques that you can use, like symmetry and like asymmetry and like things. And one is rhythm, which is where you have the like rhythmic repetition of something at a particular frequency across space. Vertical rhythm is the repetition across space in the vertical axis. And for typesetting, it's typically you want to have this rhythm show up in the spacing of all of the type on your page. So, for example, within a paragraph, you want that baseline to be at a consistent space from baseline to baseline. The first baseline distance from this to the second baseline is the same as from the second to the third, which is the same as from the third to the fourth, etc. The exact metrics you're using to decide what that distance is varies from writing system to writing system. Like for us, it's the alphabetic baseline. For Chinese and Japanese, they look at it a slightly different way. Mm-hmm. But fundamentally, you want this kind of repetitive rhythm. And then it's actually like a lot of well-typeset documents will take that into consideration, not just within a sequence of the same font size, roughly, like within a paragraph or across like a series of paragraphs, but also when there's a larger interruption, such as a heading or an image or whatever, you kind of have almost like this grid that you're resuming once you skip over that. You might interrupt that grid once in a while if you're not trying to line things up from side to side, but generally if it's a short interruption, like you'll pick up kind of the graphic designers want to keep that rhythm going through as if that text was continuing at that same font size throughout the whole document, or at least through the shorter interruptions.
Yeah. Okay. A question about block step align.
Okay.
There's a lot of other properties that control how gaps work in CSS, like grid gap, flex up, and whatnot. What are the differences of block step align and those related properties from how those work over in the layout systems?
So block step align only at this point applies to block level boxes where the other gap properties don't do anything, but it aligns it within the space that you're allotting it for. So you have the step sizing, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's not going to have any effect if you aren't step sizing. If you're just doing normal sizing, then no. But if let's say you have a box that is 30 ems tall, and you have a rhythm that is 30 ems is really huge. Maybe maybe 60 pixels or 70 pixels tall.
Okay. And
you have 20 pixel kind of rhythm that you're trying to keep. So you need that box to take up 80 pixels worth of space. Otherwise, you'll interrupt your rhythm. Mm-hmm. And so we have to increase the effective size of the box as far as layout is concerned to 80 pixels. So we have to add 5 pixels somewhere, or 10 pixels somewhere. We can add 5 pixels above and 5 pixels below. We can add 10 pixels above, or we can add 10 pixels below, and these create different kind of shifts, like where is that space going? So we could have defined the property in terms of where are you adding the space, above, below, or both sides. But the current design in the draft is to reuse the thought process in the alignment properties, reuse the same keywords and the same syntax, and just think of it as like kind of almost have this invisible virtual container, and then you've got the box inside there, and how are you aligning it within that box?
That makes a lot of sense. Do you have any experience with InDesign? You ever worked with any of those sort of tools?
I have, actually. I find it really frustrating because I'm coming from the CSS background, and where we have this magical keyword called auto, and then it like just sizes the box to fit the text. And in InDesign, if you don't size the box to fit the text yourself, the box will not fix the text. And then you like change the text, and then you have to go and resize the box, and you're like, did I really make it fit properly, or did it not fit properly? And you're like, oh, I have to go through like the submenus and be like, please auto fit this. I'm like, why can't you just do that for me all the time?
Yeah. Specifically though, have you ever worked with the baseline grids over in InDesign?
I haven't.
Okay. We'll skip over the question then, because I was asking about the relationship between those and how our vertical rhythm properties would work.
So we did have a proposal for a baseline grid in CSS. It's still up there as a draft. The tricky thing with baseline grids in CSS is that with a baseline grid, the size of an item depends on its position. In a lot of places in CSS, the position of an item depends on its size.
Yeah.
This creates a really difficult bunch of problems that were kind of scary. And so we thought maybe we don't want to solve them right now, and we can try to handle the easy cases a slightly different way. If you want a super strict baseline rhythm across your whole page, or a grid would be pretty great. But there are use cases for having looser grids, and so it seemed reasonable to try to address those and to try to also like make it possible to do strict grids in the simpler cases, using the step sizing stuff and everything else I discussed.
Yeah, so long as you're a little disciplined, you can still get a strict grid.
Yeah,
You just have to be
and you
careful
don't
with
have
it.
anything too complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's a little bit more abstract question now.
Okay.
What part of CSS do you find to be the most elegant in its concept or execution?
I think the overall design principles I find really inspiring.
Go into more detail.
Because a lot of like CSS is, it seems like this haphazard bunch of random things that do things. But there's been kind of this consistent idea in the CSS Working Group, starting from back when Håkon and Bert were working on it, that this design system should be robust. It should be resistant to like things going wrong, because they do all the time on the web. Like fonts don't load. You have a bigger screen, a smaller screen, a different operating system with.
As we saw during this talk, yeah.
Yeah, like just all kind of things goes wrong, and CSS tries to be resilient to that and to try and make sure that, well, it might not look beautiful, but at least we can still make it readable. I think there's a value that we have been trying to uphold for trying to make things, the computer do a lot of those calculations, so it's and trying to fit to the screen and stuff. So there's this idea about flexibility, that you can take a layout and try and fit it into any kind of a size with any kind of a content, and you're expressing these kind of like your goal of the design rather than the specific numbers of the design. And that allows this to kind of create, allows CSS to kind of figure it out and make it fit, so that when you have a multi-column layout, for example, you say, I want 30 em columns, and it's like, well, I got 40 ems available. What do you want me to do? It's like, oh, I just want to have 40 em columns. It's okay. And it looks like it was always meant to be 40 columns. So like, that's always been there in CSS. There's been this idea also of usability. It doesn't matter how powerful your language is. If people can't figure out how to use it, then or how to express the like really sophisticated ideas that they want to have. And we really fell down on that in like the 2000s, right? Because we didn't have a real layout system. There was these ideas of like these layout systems we wanted to create to build on top of what we had started with in the like 90s. But we had to clean up this mess of interop.
Yeah.
And so we didn't have time to actually work it. And once we started to like actually be able to focus back on that, we could pick up these ideas which had always been running through the CSS Working Group. There's been a number of proposals that just got rejected because it was like, no, you're not robust enough, you are not usable enough, or whatever, like that they got reworked or they came back or they just never made it through. And that's how we got, Grid and Flexbox being the systems that are so powerful and robust today.
All right. Well, it's a great time to end it. Thank you very much, Elika.
Thank you.